support the rent strike because we know that students need a better deal now. It's obvious that we've been cynically exploited through this crisis, with our health and well-being and the quality of our education all being sacrificed to maximise profits for the universities, and this is not acceptable. Students need change now. We demand to be taken seriously, and we're standing up against the marketised, profit-driven higher education system. As students and young people who are also socialists, we support the rent strike because we believe that collective action is powerful and it can change the world. We demand free education for everyone, and we demand safe, comfortable, and affordable housing for everyone. Our current housing system is not fit for purpose. No one should be homeless. No one should be paying half their income to landlords. Everybody has the right to a home, and nobody should be denied that because they can't afford to pay. This meeting brings together students, socialists, housing activists, rent strike organisers, and trade unionists to discuss how the current rent strike can win much needed concessions for students, and how we can build this into a powerful grassroots movement to change the system for good. Because when we're struggling against issues in our specific areas, we might win important concessions in those areas, such as the concessions already won by students in Bristol and Manchester. But in order to meaningfully challenge the capitalist system, we're going to need solidarity across different groups. We need solidarity between uni staff and students, between students and workers, solidarity among rent strikers themselves, and solidarity among the organised left to build a real opposition and to take this struggle all the way. So unfortunately, the first speaker that we were going to have tonight was Billy from the SAFER campaign, which is Student Action for a Fair and Educated Response. Unfortunately, she is not able to make it. She sends her apologies. And I think you should all go and follow the SAFER campaign on their social media to check out the work that they're doing. So first up, we have got Greg, who is a Student Socialist Alternative member. So take it away, Greg.
Thanks, Miranda. So I think one of the main things that these rent strikes really show is that people are really increasingly fighting back for our education system. And this is a trend that kind of started in 2018 with UCU strikes and the student solidarity and support of that. It's really been kind of sped up by the pandemic. And actually these are the same fight or parts of the same fight at least. Not just because all working class people have common interests against the bosses, but also specifically because we share working and learning conditions on campus with staff. And the VCs who drive the cuts to pay in pensions and kind of drive the increasing workloads for staff. And they do this for the same reason as they cram students into unsafe accommodation to squeeze extortionate rent and fees from them. And this is because of the logic of marketization. Capitalism is a threat not only to the quality of our education, but also our very health due to the constant pressure to drive down costs and push up rent and fees at the expense of quality and safety. And this is true in ordinary times with poor quality accommodation and at times unsafe working conditions, but cannot be highlighted more clearly than it is in the current situation of this pandemic that we're living through today. So while things never should have been allowed to get as bad as the disastrous situation we're currently in, and rightfully, many people feel anger about this, but also we can take hope from the fact that workers and students are getting organised and fighting back. So the rent strikes are a great example of this fight for our education system. And as the concessions that have already been won, for example, at the University of Manchester, at Cambridge University and UAE, they show us that when we get organised to fight, we have great power and so we can win. We also need to link up the movement with staff across campuses. So that's with lecturers, with cleaners, administrators, IT support, and all the other workers who are necessary to keep our universities running. This will enable us to carry the struggle beyond the current dispute and beyond the pandemic to fight for universities that serve our needs. So, we can fight for safe, good quality and affordable housing. We can fight for teaching and learning conditions that are suitable to provide the best quality education and welfare. We can fight to bring universities into public ownership and abolish the marketized profit incentive that is tuition fees. We can fight for an education system and society that's run democratically to put our working and living conditions and the quality of our education before the profits of the few. And with the unified power of the working class, we can win all this and more.
Thanks, Greg. Hard agree to all of that. It's so important that we link up our struggles because we can be really effective with struggles on a university campus. It's a really effective site of struggle. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes. Okay. Yes, we have just started an Instagram. Go and follow us on Instagram. The link is going to be posted in the chat. That's the Instagram for Student Socialist Alternative, and I would strongly recommend that everybody checks us out. So our next speaker is a seasoned housing campaigner from North London, who's going to talk about a rent strike, a private rent strike that's been going on, and some of the challenges and also some of the successes of that rent strike. So I'd like to welcome Jordan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me join you. And thanks for coming, and massive solidarity to all of the students here on rent strike. So my name is Jordan. I'm also a fixed-term researcher at Birkbeck in the University of London, in addition to being a kind of organizer within the block of tenants that I live in. So my interests really converge, and the work I've been doing really converge here with the student rent strike movement, and I'm like so thrilled that it's happening. So yeah, I just wanted to share a bit about the housing campaign that I've been involved in, and some of the lessons that we've learned. And I'll just put on a timer so that I don't go over too much. I'll probably talk really fast because there's like a lot I want to say, and I don't want to take up too much time, but tell me if I'm going too quickly. Yeah, I live in a block, in a flat with 3 flatmates, in a block of 170 flats in North London, privately rented. And we learned that all of the flats are owned by John Christodoulou, who is a billionaire who lives in the tax haven of Monaco, has a $50 million yacht, and tries very hard to hide that he's a landlord through all kinds of shell companies and legal mechanisms, but he is actually our landlord. And when the lockdown first began, like the first lockdown last year, we had a WhatsApp group of tenants that existed beforehand that had kind of helped to get people on by just sort of handing out flyers. And we used that to put together a collective letter asking for a discount on the rent for 20% off, and a guarantee that no one would be evicted. And we got 100 and so tenants to sign it. And then we received this very harsh response, which said, no way would we grant your request. You guys have canceled holidays, which you can use to save, which you can use to pay us the rent in full. And I'm like basically quoting from the letter here. They said, the wear and tear will be increasing on your flat while you're self-isolating, and this will be at the cost of the landlord. So they treated us with pure contempt. As a result of this letter, really, we received a lot of press attention from the very beginning of this as a kind of example of how a cruel landlord behaves during coronavirus. After that happened, people were in the building were very angry, wanted to kind of push back. So we joined the London Renters Union, which is an organization that campaigns to support renters through taking action. And we made a lot of noise. We kept speaking to the press. We kind of grew our numbers. We demanded a meeting. And as a result, we ended up in, we went through a quite difficult phase where the response we got was a sort of endless barrage of sort of classical union busting tactics. So we received first legal threats. A number of the organizers, myself included, were told that we would be responsible for any unpaid rent in the building, that they'd take us to court for this. And I was told I'd have to pay up to £20,000 in legal fees. We received eviction notices. So my own flat received a Section 21 no-fault eviction, which you've probably heard about. And we were told we were being evicted for it was a business decision. And other households that were in rent arrears because people were struggling to pay. Households that hadn't paid, just not because they were on rent strike necessarily, but because they couldn't afford to pay, started receiving eviction notices as well. And then, of course, there was divide and rule. And I think this is something important to keep in mind for student rent strikers. There was an attempt where some renters were offered a 20% discount, exactly what we'd requested, but that they'd have to pay that back later. So it was a deferment. And they were told that that would be taken away if they spoke to any other tenants about it. So a very classic attempt to keep us from working together. And then all kinds of even crazier stuff, like we had security photographing us in the building. We learned that our WhatsApp group was infiltrated, and that's how a lot of information was kind of making its way to the landlord. So shit got really insane, excuse my language. And this did weaken us a bit, and we lost some members, but we also fought back. And so just in the last 2 minutes or so, I want to say a bit about things that we've achieved so far and some of the lessons we've learned. So we got a lot of support from kind of local MPs, from press. We held a big demonstration outside the landlord's hotel. We finally got we began the process of negotiations with an agent for the landlord. And during the first meeting, he told me, "Our reputation is in tatters because of you," which is one of the most gratifying things I've ever heard. And then the biggest accomplishment actually was, small concessions have been made here and there, and some of the eviction notices have been dropped. But through the actions that we did, we always suspected that there was some legal violations that the landlord had committed, but we didn't actually have the necessary evidence we needed to really use this. And so we put a lot of pressure on the local council. And I really want to emphasize, this is kind of one of the biggest lessons. There's a legal aspect to this, but it was very much a political issue as well. The council was not interested in investigating the issue around property licenses until we made a lot of noise and had a big campaign. And then they came around and they looked at our flats and they confirmed that, in fact, the landlord had been negligent in kind of following the rules of the law, and that we could actually launch a case where we might be eligible for up to a year's rent back in the courts. So this has been the biggest win, and this is what we're really organizing towards. And again, it's kind of a legal strategy, but it's like it completely wouldn't be possible without a large political campaign, because it's a really hard thing to win. And what we've had to do is create a sort of team of people who are doing loads of admin all the time, but also meeting tenants, learning about the situation of their flat and whether they're eligible to do this, and figuring out a way that once we win this money, which we're now pretty confident we can, that we can do it in a way that's also sort of shares some of the wealth with people in the building who wouldn't otherwise necessarily be eligible for it. So, I mean, that's kind of the biggest point I want to convey is I know a lot of rent strikers and like housing activists, are really nervous about the retaliation that you're going to receive, that you have received. And that's absolutely real and terrifying. And I think the thing to keep in mind is the law is important, but of course it's not your friend. And your best defense really is a kind of offense. So, thinking about obviously like understanding what your legal position is, but also understanding kind of what the balance of forces is. So, drawing on solidarity, carrying on action to generate more solidarity, continuing to go wider to draw in groups that weren't involved before, building your base, having loads of conversations, reaching out to the press, doing loads of admin, like really boring stuff, but doing it in a kind of collective way, doing your research on who your adversary is. All of those things are really, the sort of fundamental ingredients that make any kind of political strategy work, but including and especially a housing campaign. And so finally, I just wanted to say, obviously demands must be strategic and winnable, but it's also very important not to compromise on a wider socialist message. So, we all know that all of this activism, whether it's rent striking or anything else going on at this time, is about much more than just COVID-19. It's about much more than the shameful behavior of any bosses or VCs or landlords. It's about the fight for a free education and a free society. So I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you so much, Jordan. That was really interesting and equal parts kind of terrifying, but also really reassuring. Because I'm involved in a rent strike, and I'm sure lots of people here are as well. And it does start to get pretty hairy when when you're getting all these threats from the landlords, but it's really great and reassuring that we can connect with other people who have been through the same thing and who know how to approach these things, and we can share information and we can have solidarity in that way. So thank you so much, Jordan. I'm going to plug now in preparation for our next speaker, I'm going to plug the Rent Strike Collective Handbook, which is a free online resource. If you want to do a rent strike, that is a really good place to start. It basically gives you the ABCs of what you need to do and how. So our next speaker that's coming up is Ben, who's a founding member of the Rent Strike Collective, and he's going to talk more about tactics, I think. So welcome to the floor, Ben.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for your time this evening. So as Miranda said, I thought we'd talk about tactics, but I thought first it'd be good just to talk about why rent strikes are a particularly good sort of tactic in the context of the universities as a whole. I was at UCL during the 2010 student protests, and obviously the big shift that happened in 2010 was the fee increase. And this was really about introducing a market into higher education institutions. And if you went through, as I did, a lot of the discussions and minutes and meetings happening in the run-up to the 2010 fee increase, you'd see university managers were acknowledging that the increase in tuition fees would come at the price of huge cuts to teaching budgets, and that universities as a whole would have less money. But they still went ahead and lobbied for this. The Russell Group lobbied for the tuition fee increase, right? Why? And the reason is because when you privatize the income stream, as you do with tuition fees, you can financialize it. So the amount of money that the government gives to universities every year might change, depending on whether it's Labour or Conservatives or whatever the political priorities are. But the income from students in the form of tuition fees remains consistent. It's always the same. So with £9,000 a year, and there's always more demand than there is supply. This means you can go to banks and financial institutions and take out huge amounts of borrowing that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. And the reason university managers wanted to do this is so that they could fund expansions in research projects, fund new facilities, fund new resources that otherwise weren't really coming after sort of 20 to 30 years of austerity that really began, with the Thatcherite reforms to the welfare state. One of the ways the university managers saw as being key to balancing the books in this new funding environment was to maximize the amount of money that universities were making from rents. And so we've seen this huge shift across the university sector to universities becoming landlords, but also becoming huge property developers. So in Cambridge, the University of Cambridge is now the biggest property developer in East Anglia. UCL, at the time when I was there, was trying to demolish a council estate and to forcibly dispossess hundreds of working class residents to build a new campus. This is happening across the country. Student fees are being leveraged to build new accommodation blocks and to build new urban spaces to maximize returns for the university. And if you look at graphs that plot the increases in rents year on year at universities, you will see that since the 2010 fee increases, which took effect in 2012, rents have skyrocketed. By the time I was involved in organising the rent strikes at UCL in 2016, the rents have gone up by something like 40% year on year, despite the accommodation being dilapidated and there being no material changes. And so really rents and the income from student accommodation, as well as things like conference centres, are crucial to the increase in tuition fees and maintaining the neoliberalization of the universities. And this obviously makes them a very good target of opportunity for students who want to try and break down that funding system. And what we're really seeing in the pandemic is that fundamental contradiction at the heart of university financing is now being exposed. The universities simply are not financially viable without students paying rent. Now, of course, we would argue that higher education is a universal social good, and we all stand to benefit from a well-educated society. What's happened post-2010 is really we're all being forced to pay for our own training as sort of future workers and middle managers. And that's why we're seeing this insane situation now where students have basically been conned into going back to university to take up accommodation and to courses, these huge fees, to really enjoy none of the benefits. And it creates a huge public health disaster in the process, because I think we all know that the impacts that students concentrated in these accommodation units have had on the spread of COVID. And so that's why rent is both a crucial part of the university system, but also is crucial that we really take this moment to attack it. I've taken quite a bit of my time to explain that point, and I just want to talk in 3 key principles to bear in mind when organising rent strikes. The first is to mobilise people, and this sounds like obvious, but the way we did this at UCL was the idea of conditional commitment. So we just said, will you do it if everyone else does it? If we get 500 people signed up to join this rent strike, will you join the rent strike? And so creating that sense of safety in numbers, but also working to keep people together and keep the strike unified through regular meetings, regular social events, regular contact, even simple things like regularly leafleting doors and putting up posters is really key to building a successful strike. The second thing is to have a strategy. Like, if you don't have a plan, you plan to fail, as they say. You know, for example, that rent will be paid on a certain day. Perhaps rent is paid monthly, perhaps it's paid termly, but each one of those dates is an opportunity to gather more people to join the rent strike. You should build some sort of timeline that maximizes the amount of people that are joining your strike every time. And the sort of second big part of strategy, and the third point I really want to make, is the idea of escalation. As Jordan said, you're fighting a political campaign, not a legal campaign. And the universities will throw threats at you, they'll throw threats of eviction, they'll throw threats of legal action. For every action, there needs to be a bigger reaction by students. There needs to be constant escalation to really hammer these people back down into submission to your demands. And so a strategy should look for weak points of the university. You know, are they dependent on revenue from conferences? Are there key events happening that it would be embarrassing to disrupt? Is there, embarrassing communications you can put into the media? Can you work with other universities to collectively target university management at different institutions to maximize political pressure? So it's these sort of 3 key points: mobilization, strategizing, and escalation, really, that together can start to bring more of the wins in that we saw at UCL in 2016 and we saw in Manchester earlier this year. So good luck. Oh, and the final one was cops off campus. They'll try and intimidate you by sending the police and security guards to harass whatever you do. As soon as they do, the university, you need to raise the slogan, cops off campus, and mobilize everyone to resist this oppression. When they tried to oppress a lot of the anti-austerity work that's happening in Bloomsbury in 2013, cops off campus ended up bringing thousands and thousands of people out in defense of the right to protest at universities. And the consequence was the cops weren't seen on campus for many years, because they realized that there was a real threat of widespread disorder should they return. It's like, you need to defend the autonomy of your own political space, and cops off campus is an essential demand in the context of the rent strikes. Cheers.
Wow, thank you so much, Ben. That was amazing. I think I speak for everyone here when I say that I'm feeling very riled up and ready to kick some cops off campus. So the rent strike movement nationally is kind of, becoming a coordinated mass movement. So here we're screen sharing the rally that's coming up on the 25th. Some pretty big names speaking at this rally. So I think it's it's going to be really important that everybody, kind of comes along to support this and see where this rent strike movement is going to go, and to, take the fight nationally, which is really, really exciting. I'm definitely going to be there. So next we've got Sam to speak, who is a member of the UCU, Universities and Colleges Union Anti-Casualisation Caucus. So we're going to hear from him now from the staff point of view about the rent strike. So take it away, Sam.
Thanks, Miranda, and thanks so much to Student Socialist Alternative for inviting me to speak on a really important topic, I think, and a really important time. So I'm a UCU branch officer and a member of the UCU Anti-Casualisation Committee. And I want to say, first of all, that an incredibly bleak year for education workers. The rent strike movement, the development of a new wave of student activism, if you like, and in particular the fantastic victories at the University of Manchester have been a massive shot in the arm, a massive inspiration to higher education workers, particularly in UCU, as we're facing up to what's coming at us now. And I think it's particularly important, one, because we're seeing students organised directly against the marketised university that does treat students as cash cows, basically, that is interested only in squeezing out as much in tuition fees, as much in rent as they can possibly get away with. And Miranda, I think, said in the introduction that time and time again, we're seeing students' health and well-being being trumped by the need to create profit. And that's exactly right. And I think that it's important to recognise that the same marketisation, privatisation of education that means that students are just treated as cash cows, really, herded into clearly unsafe accommodation that, as Ben said, has created a public health disaster. It's that same marketised university and the same marketised university management that in the last 10 years have presided over higher education workers losing over 20% of the value of our pay in real terms, has seen widening racial pay gaps in the university, with BME workers paid less than their white counterparts, has seen a widening gender pay gap. People may not realise this, but in the higher education sector in UK universities now, we have the largest gender pay gap in the Western world, which is quite something. And also spiraling workloads. Many academics and many UK higher education staff working sometimes as many 70 and 80 hours a week. And in particular, what I'd like to focus on, the issue of casualisation. So people who are working on some form of insecure contract, whether it's fixed term contracts, whether it's hourly paid contracts, 0 hours, whatever. I'm a sessional tutor. I have no guaranteed hours. I just, every term, every semester, I just get what I'm given. I've actually lost about a third of my teaching hours this term, purely because of the lockdown, and that's not compensated anyway because I don't have that kind of job security, and I'm not unusual at all. Well over 50% now of staff involved in teaching at UK universities are employed on some kind of casual contract, some kind of insecure contract. We now make up the majority of higher education workers. Now, that was even before this pandemic started, and what we've been through since then has been devastating, in all honesty. Now, last summer, obviously, because of the pandemic, universities were panicking that they wouldn't be able to get the same numbers of students into universities that they previously had. And in particular, they were concerned that international students from outside the European Union wouldn't be persuaded to come to UK universities because, of course, there's no limits at all on what universities can charge non-EU international students, and subsequently they ripped them off to the tune of tens of thousands of pounds a year. And what they did in response to that was basically to scrap the jobs of perhaps as many, it's hard to know the figures because of how murky casualised employment can be sometimes, of higher education workers, and maybe as many as tens of thousands of jobs went last summer. So people who were on fixed term contracts didn't get them renewed. People who are on hourly paid contracts like myself were just told there's not going to be any teaching for you, that's it, you're done. And that's an incredible response, right? As soon as student numbers fluctuate, the marketised university says, right, well, what we need to do is bin off as many education staff as we can possibly get away with. That's their response to a crisis, is that we should have fewer education workers. And of course, that meant that those remaining in universities in higher education had far higher workloads and were trying to teach sometimes double the number of students. Now, in the event, they did manage to force quite significant numbers of students, persuade them onto campus and whatever. In fact, many departments in many universities actually had more students than the previous year, creating a bizarre situation where you've got far fewer members of teaching staff to teach a far larger number of students. And the attacks are continuing. I was reading just today in The Guardian that there are 10 different universities that have announced plans for redundancies, and universities say this is how they plan for contingency in a global pandemic because student numbers may not be healthy again. But we're seeing job losses at Leeds, at Liverpool, at Southampton, Solent, at loads of different universities around the country. I want to give a shout out to my UCU siblings at University of Brighton, who've actually already been taking strike action even before Christmas to ward off redundancies. Amazingly, in the middle of a pandemic, when everything's online, when everything's remote learning, the University of Brighton decided that it would be a good idea to make IT staff redundant. So at the University of Brighton, they've been on strike fighting to save the jobs of IT workers. And I have to say they've done magnificently in the circumstances. Of course, they can't picket together because of the pandemic, but they've organised amazing virtual pickets. They linked up with Rolls-Royce workers in Lancashire who are on strike at the same time. And are fighting an amazing fight. There's many other branches that, of course, are following them. At the University of Liverpool, for example, they're balloting for industrial action to fight against redundancies. And we're now, if you like, because we have to, we're moving on to a war footing with the employers where we know we have to go all out to save jobs. And I think I'm so pleased to be at this meeting and to see the development of the student movement, because, of course, what we know from the example of the University of Manchester is that actually collectively, when we get organised, we have an incredible amount of power. The marketised education system that we have doesn't work for any of us. It means hyper exploitation and horrendous working conditions for staff. And it means students are treated as cash cows rather than as people who deserve, as we all do, the right to a decent and free education. But through these movements that we can build, through organising strikes, occupations, demonstrations, rent strikes, collectively we can organise, we can say that we're not going to accept that, and we can place demands on the education system and demands on universities and build a different kind of education system based on need and not profit. My time's probably up, I think, so I'm going to leave it there. But just once again, thank you for inviting me to speak, and solidarity, all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. That was great to hear from you. Yeah, student staff solidarity is so key to this movement being successful. And yeah, we that has to be a demand, for end of 0 hours contracts and all of the other demands. They're key to the rent strike, and we need to not let them slip off because yeah, it's absolutely key. So yeah, now I'm gonna plug joining Socialist Alternative, because that's how we've put this all together, and I think this event really shows what a benefit it can be for student activists to be involved in a socialist organization such as Socialist Alternative, so we can bring together all of these different comrades with different experiences, and we can support each other, and we can help each other to dig in our heels when the going gets tough, and we can put forward a consistently socialist platform and fight together for a better world that we all so desperately need and want.